One night, the alarms went off at one of the most important American military installations in the entire Middle East. Not near the front lines, not in a war zone, deep inside Saudi Arabia, hundreds of kilometers from Iranian territory, and when the smoke cleared, something had changed, not just on that runway, but across every military base in the region. Because what Iran hit that night wasn't just steel and concrete, it was the idea that distance still means safety, and that idea may never fully recover. Let me take you inside what actually happened, why it matters far more than the headlines suggested, and what it tells us about how this conflict is being fought in ways that most people aren't fully grasping yet. Prince Sultan Air Base sits in the middle of the Saudi desert. It has been one of the central hubs of American air power in the region for years. Surveillance aircraft, aerial refueling tankers, command and control planes, all operating from the same complex. For a long time, its distance from Iran was considered one of its greatest protections. Geography was the shield. But on March 27, 2026, that shield was tested in a way nobody could easily ignore. According to U.S. officials and defense reporting, an Iranian missile and drone strike hit the base that night. Multiple aircraft were damaged on the ground. At least 10 to 12 American service members were reported wounded, with some seriously injured. The attack involved a coordinated mix of ballistic missiles and long-range drones. Air defenses intercepted some of what was incoming, but not all of it. And in modern warfare, even one weapon reaching its target changes the entire calculus of the battlefield. Now, if you heard about this attack and thought it was simply one strike among many in a broader conflict, you would not be entirely wrong. But you would be missing the part of the story that actually matters. Because what Iran targeted at Prince Sultan Air Base was not random. And once you understand what those aircraft actually do, the strategic logic behind the attack becomes impossible to dismiss. Among the aircraft damaged during the strike were aerial refueling tankers. Specifically, at least one KC-135 Stratotanker was reported hit. And alongside that, reports later indicated that a Boeing E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft was also struck during the attack. If you're not familiar with either of those aircraft, let me explain why losing them, even temporarily, is one of the most disruptive things that can happen to an air campaign. Modern air warfare does not work the way action movies portray it. It is not simply fighter jets taking off, flying to a target, and returning home. Every single combat mission in a region like this depends on an invisible web of support aircraft operating in the background, the aircraft that never get mentioned in the headlines, but that every pilot and every commander absolutely depends on. The KC-135 Stratotanker is a flying fuel station. Fighter jets like the F-15 and the F-35 carry only so much fuel. Without refueling, their operational range and endurance are limited. But when a tanker meets them in the air and transfers fuel mid-flight, those jets can patrol longer, strike targets deeper, and maintain a continuous presence over contested airspace for hours beyond what their own tanks would allow. Take the tankers out of the equation, even temporarily, and the entire air campaign becomes shorter, more limited, and more complicated to sustain. But the AWACS aircraft is something else entirely. The E-3 Sentry is one of the most strategically critical platforms in the American military inventory, and there are only a limited number of them. From the outside, it looks almost unusual. A large rotodome, a radar dish mounted on top of a modified Boeing airframe, slowly rotating as the aircraft cruises at altitude. But inside that aircraft is a flying command center. Operators sit at consoles monitoring radar screens that track aircraft across hundreds of miles in every direction. They watch for incoming missiles. They coordinate fighters, guide pilots toward threats, track the position of friendly aircraft, and provide commanders with real-time awareness of everything happening across a massive volume of airspace. In a complex air battle, the AWACS is the central nervous system of the entire operation. Without it, pilots lose visibility. Commanders lose coordination. The coherence of the air campaign begins to fracture at its edges. That is why analysts immediately focused on those particular aircraft when the damage reports came in. Because the selection of those targets was not random, it was deliberate. Hitting refueling tankers and AWACS surveillance platforms is not about destroying hardware for its own sake. It is about degrading the architecture that makes the entire air campaign function. Military planners sometimes call this attacking the support architecture of an adversary's operations. The idea is simple but powerful. Instead of trying to defeat fighter jets directly, which are fast, maneuverable, and extremely difficult to hit, you target the systems that enable those fighters to operate effectively in the first place. You hit the eyes, the fuel supply, the coordination layer. You don't have to destroy the weapon, you just have to blind the hand that holds it. And here is what makes that strategy particularly significant in this context. Each AWACS aircraft represents a major strategic asset. They are expensive, relatively rare, and used across multiple theaters simultaneously. If one is damaged severely enough to require extended maintenance or replacement, That is a gap that cannot simply be filled overnight. The same applies to specialized tankers. The United States does not have an infinite number of these platforms sitting idle waiting to replace losses. Every one that goes offline creates a real operational problem that ripples across the entire theater of war. Now step back for a moment and think about the geography of what just happened. Prince Sultan Air Base is not near Iran. It is not close to the Gulf Coast. It sits deep in the Saudi desert, in terrain that was previously considered a kind of natural buffer. For years, the assumption was that bases this far from Iranian territory were outside the immediate threat envelope. That assumption just collapsed in a single night. What the strike demonstrated is something that defense analysts have been quietly concerned about for years, but that has now moved from theoretical to undeniably real. Iran has developed the capability to strike targets hundreds of kilometers beyond its borders, even against hardened military installations, using a combination of ballistic missiles and long-range drones. These are not crude weapons. Ballistic missiles travel enormous distances in minutes. Cruise missiles can fly low, hugging the terrain, avoiding radar detection until the final moments of their approach. Long-range drones can navigate autonomously across vast distances, loitering, maneuvering, and striking with increasing precision. And when these systems are launched in coordinated waves, they can overwhelm air defense systems, not because those defenses are incompetent, but because the mathematics of saturation work against the defender. Every interceptor has a cost, a reload time, a limited number of missiles. If enough weapons are launched simultaneously from enough directions, some will get through. That is not a failure of the defense. That is the logic of modern strike saturation, and it is a logic that favors the attacker in certain scenarios, which raises the question that military planners across the entire region immediately began asking after this strike. If Prince Sultan can be hit, what else can be reached? Because the range of modern Iranian missile and drone systems does not end at the Saudi border. Bases in Kuwait, Qatar, the UAE, Iraq, and other parts of the region are all potentially within reach of various systems in Iran's inventory. The geography of risk has expanded dramatically, and commanders know it. The response inside military circles was immediate. Aircraft dispersal procedures were reviewed. Spreading aircraft across multiple locations instead of concentrating them in one place reduces the potential damage from any single strike. Air defense systems were put on heightened readiness. The spacing between parked aircraft was reassessed. All of these adjustments take time, consume resources, and require coordination. And during an active conflict, that kind of operational adjustment costs something. It slows tempo. It diverts attention. It forces commanders to spend energy on defense rather than offense, which is, of course, precisely the point of the strategy. There is another dimension to this strike that deserves attention, and it is one that many media reports largely glossed over. The timing of the attack mattered. It came during a period when American and Allied air forces had been conducting sustained operations against Iranian military infrastructure, radar systems, missile launch sites, command and control nodes, all coming under pressure from the air. Iran was absorbing those strikes. And then it chose to respond not by trying to engage American fighter jets in contested airspace, where the outcome would likely favor the United States, but by reaching deep into the rear area and hitting the support infrastructure that those jets depend on. Military strategists have a term for this kind of move. It is sometimes called deterrence through reach. The concept is straightforward. If an adversary believes that its bases, even its supposedly secure rear area installations, are vulnerable to attack, it introduces a layer of caution into every operational decision. Commanders begin asking not only what they can do to the enemy, but what the enemy can do to them and where. That calculus can slow the pace of an air campaign. It can make planners more conservative. It introduces uncertainty into every mission plan, and uncertainty, in warfare, has consequences. But perhaps the most important takeaway from the Prince Sultan strike is the one that points forward rather than backward, because this attack did not happen in isolation. It was part of a broader escalation pattern that stretched across multiple domains simultaneously. Missile strikes, drone attacks, naval incidents, cyber activity, all happening in overlapping windows across a theater that spans several countries and thousands of square miles. The battlefield of this conflict does not have clean edges. It does not respect the boundaries that military planners drew on their maps before hostilities began. Modern warfare increasingly operates across what strategists call multiple domains simultaneously: the air, the sea, cyber networks, logistics chains, and now explicitly the support infrastructure behind combat operations. Each domain influences the others. A strike that damages AWACS coverage affects what happens in the air. Disruption to air operations affects what can be done at sea. Pressure on logistics affects how long any campaign can be sustained. These systems are all connected, and targeting any one of them sends vibrations through all the others. And this brings us to the broader pattern that analysts began noticing after the Prince Sultan attack. Because it was not the first time that Iranian strikes had appeared to focus specifically on the support architecture behind American air operations rather than on combat aircraft directly. There is a logic to that selection of targets, and it suggests a coherent strategy rather than random escalation. You do not have to defeat the fighter jets. You do not have to win in a direct confrontation in contested airspace, which is extraordinarily difficult and costly. You make the entire operation harder to sustain by eroding the systems that keep it running. You compress the operational range of the air campaign by degrading the tankers. You reduce situational awareness by damaging the AWACS. You force commanders to constantly adapt, relocate, and defend. Over time, that kind of sustained pressure can accumulate into something that affects the trajectory of the conflict itself. Think about what a base like Prince Sultan actually is, beyond just the aircraft it houses. It is not simply a parking lot for military hardware. It is a complex operational ecosystem. Fuel depots, maintenance hangars, communication centers, command posts, intelligence nodes, logistics facilities. All of these systems are deeply interconnected. Damage to the aircraft affects the missions. Damage to the fuel infrastructure affects the turnaround time between sorties. Disruption to the communication systems affects the command and control of the entire theater. When one part of that ecosystem comes under attack, every other part has to compensate. Missions get delayed, sorties get canceled or consolidated. The operational rhythm of the air campaign breaks down in ways that may not be visible in any single news report, but that accumulate into real strategic effects over time. And there's something else worth sitting with. Even when the physical damage from an attack is ultimately repaired, even when aircraft are returned to service and runways are patched and personnel recover, the psychological and strategic effect of the strike does not simply disappear. It remains embedded in the decision-making of every commander across the theater. It changes how forces are positioned. It shapes which operations are considered viable and which are judged too risky given the new threat environment. It changes the questions that get asked in every planning meeting. And that kind of behavioral effect can be just as significant as the physical damage itself. What the attack on Prince Sultan Air Base ultimately revealed is something that has been building for years but has now arrived with undeniable clarity. Distance no longer provides the protection it once did. The concept of a safe rear area, a place where support infrastructure and logistics networks can operate without serious risk, has been fundamentally challenged by the combination of long-range ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and autonomous drones. The map of vulnerability has expanded. Every installation in the region must now be treated as a potential target, regardless of how far it sits from the front lines. That is a profound shift in the logic of how this kind of conflict can be fought. And it has implications not just for the current situation in the Middle East, but for how military planners around the world are rethinking the concept of safe basing, air defense coverage, and the dispersal of strategic assets. The era in which geography alone could be relied upon to protect rear area facilities is ending. What replaces it is a far more complex and costly approach to base security, force protection, and operational resilience. The strike on March 27th was one night, one missile volley, one set of damaged aircraft and injured service members, but the questions it raised about the nature of this conflict and about the future of warfare more broadly will be asked for a very long time.